For 25 years, Johnny Carson served as America's favorite nighttime host, welcoming over 18,000 celebrities to his famous talk show coach. But during his lifetime, there were 9 guests that Johnny Carson reported as smelly like shit. Kirk Douglas had established himself as one of Hollywood's most intense method actors, completely immersing himself in every role with an almost religious dedication. By the time he appeared on Carson's show in the early 80s, Douglas was promoting his latest film, where he portrayed a 19th century prospector living in harsh wilderness conditions. Douglas was notorious for staying in character for months at a time, explained a talent coordinator who worked during this period. The problem was that he took this commitment to extremes that affected everyone around him. Douglas arrived at the studio having apparently not bathed in several weeks as part of his character preparation. Studio staff immediately noticed the overwhelming odor emanating from the actor as he moved through the backstage area. The smell was described by multiple witnesses as a combination of unwashed clothing, body odor, and what one crew member diplomatically called earthy authenticity taken to an unreasonable extreme. Carson was warned about the situation before Douglas's segment, remembered a production assistant who was working that night. The stage manager came to Johnny's dressing room to give him a heads up. Carson just nodded, took a deep breath, and said something like, "Well, that's dedication to the craft, I suppose." He wasn't angry, but you could tell he was mentally preparing himself for a challenging interview. When Douglas walked onto the set, the audience reaction was immediate. People in the first few rows visibly recoiled, some covering their noses, others exchanging shocked glances. Carson, ever the professional, greeted Douglas with his usual warmth, though camera operators later noted he positioned himself at a slightly greater distance than normal during the handshake. Throughout the interview, Carson employed several strategic techniques to manage the situation. He frequently reached for his coffee mug, ostensibly to take sips, but crew members observed this also allowed him to briefly shield his nose. He directed many of his questions while turned slightly away from Douglas, addressing the audience as much as his guest. Most impressively, he made several jokes about Douglas's dedication to authenticity that acknowledged the situation without directly mentioning the odor. Johnny said something like, "You've really committed to this role completely, haven't you?" recalled a camera operator who was focused on Carson during the exchange. The audience laughed because they understood exactly what he was implying. Douglas took it as a compliment about his acting method, completely oblivious to the subtext. It was masterful deflection. What made the situation particularly challenging was Douglas's apparent lack of awareness regarding how his choice affected others. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the audience's muted response to his stories and Carson's notably brief interview, which was cut shorter than originally scheduled. After the segment concluded and Douglas left the stage, Carson immediately requested that the studio be aired out during the commercial break. A stage manager opened several doors, and fans were brought in to circulate fresh air. Carson reportedly joked to his crew, "That's method acting I can respect from a distance, preferably a significant distance." The incident became legendary among show staff, not for Douglas's odor itself, but for Carson's skillful handling of an incredibly awkward situation. He managed to complete a coherent interview, keep the audience entertained, and avoid humiliating his guest, all while dealing with an assault on his senses that would have defeated less experienced hosts. Johnny had this philosophy that everyone deserves respect, even when they make questionable choices, explained a longtime producer. He wasn't going to shame Douglas on television for his method acting decisions, no matter how much those decisions affected everyone in the studio. That wasn't his style, but he also wasn't going to pretend everything was normal. He found this middle ground of gentle acknowledgement that let the audience know he was experiencing the same thing they were. Following the appearance, show producers implemented a new policy requiring advance notice from guests about any unusual character preparation that might affect the studio environment. The policy became informally known among staff as the Douglas Rule, though it was never officially labeled as such. Douglas himself apparently never realized the discomfort he'd caused. In later interviews about his career, he mentioned his appearance on Carson's show as an example of how seriously the entertainment industry took method acting, completely missing the careful diplomacy that had been required to get through his segment. Jennifer Grey. Jennifer Grey had built a glamorous career as a leading lady in romantic comedies throughout the 70s and 80s, known for her beauty, charm, and seemingly effortless elegance on screen. When she appeared on Carson's show to promote her latest film, the crew anticipated a straightforward, pleasant interview with one of Hollywood's most professional actresses. What they got was something entirely different that required all of Carson's diplomatic skills. Grey arrived at the studio looking absolutely stunning, wearing an expensive designer gown and jewelry that sparkled under the lights. However, as she settled into the guest chair, a powerful perfume scent began permeating the entire set. The fragrance wasn't subtle or pleasant. It was overwhelming, chemical, and so strong that it caused physical reactions among crew members. The perfume was so intense it was almost visible, joked a lighting technician who worked that night. I was up in the rafters and I could smell it from there. It wasn't just strong, it was this thick, cloying scent that seemed to coat your throat when you breathed. Several people started getting headaches within minutes. Carson maintained his composure as Grey sat down, though viewers who watched carefully could see him blink rapidly several times, a physical reaction to the overwhelming scent. The camera crew, positioned much closer to the action, had more difficulty concealing their discomfort. One camera operator was seen wiping tears from his eyes, which he later explained was an involuntary reaction to the perfume's intensity. Johnny was a trooper, but you could see him struggling, remembered a director who was in the control booth. He kept this smile on his face, but his eyes were watering. At one point, he actually had to turn away and cough, and he played it off like he had something caught in his throat. The audience probably didn't realize it was because the perfume was so overpowering. Grey herself seemed completely unaware of the effect her fragrance was having on everyone around her. She chatted enthusiastically about her film, laughed at Carson's jokes, and appeared to be having a wonderful time, oblivious to the fact that people within a 10-foot radius were experiencing physical discomfort. What made the situation particularly delicate was that Grey was genuinely kind and professional. She wasn't trying to cause problems. She had simply applied far too much of an already powerful perfume, creating an unintentional chemical assault on everyone in the studio. Carson handled the situation with remarkable subtlety. He never mentioned the perfume directly, but he did make a few gentle comments about how Grey always made such a strong impression and how her presence filled the room. The audience, who could smell the perfume even in the back rows, understood the double meaning and laughed appreciatively. After the interview concluded, the studio required extensive airing out before the next segment could proceed. Multiple crew members reported feeling lightheaded or experiencing headaches that persisted for hours after Grey's departure. One production assistant later revealed she had to leave early because the scent triggered a migraine. Carson handled it professionally, as always, but afterward he told several of us that interview took years off his life, recalled a staff writer. He said something about needing to develop gills so he could breathe underwater and escape perfume attacks. He was joking, but you could tell the experience had been genuinely unpleasant for him. The incident led to an interesting backstage policy. The show's talent coordinators began including gentle guidance in pre-appearance materials for guests, suggesting minimal fragrance application due to studio lighting and heat. The guidance was never attributed to any specific incident, but staff members knew it was directly inspired by Grey's memorably aromatic appearance. Grey remained a welcomed guest and appeared on the show several more times in subsequent years. Interestingly, during her later appearances, her fragrance choices were notably more subdued, leading staff to speculate that someone from her team had eventually communicated the feedback diplomatically. Carson's handling of the situation became another example of his interviewing philosophy. Maintain dignity for everyone involved, address uncomfortable realities without causing embarrassment, and find humor in human imperfection without cruelty. It was a delicate balance that few hosts could manage as skillfully. Robert De Niro. Robert De Niro was a legendary character actor who had worked steadily in Hollywood for over 4 decades by the time he appeared on Carson's show in the late 80s. De Niro was beloved for his distinctive voice, commanding presence, and memorable supporting roles in countless films. He was also, according to numerous crew members, one of the most challenging guests the show ever accommodated due to his personal habits. De Niro was a heavy smoker, consuming several packs daily for most of his adult life. The smell of cigarette smoke clung to everything about him. His clothing, his hair, even his skin seemed to emanate the stale odor of tobacco. When he walked into a room, the scent preceded him like an invisible cloud. The problem wasn't just the smoke smell, though that was certainly noticeable, explained a production assistant who worked that evening. Leonard also had this habit of not washing his clothing very often. He had these favorite jackets and shirts that he wore repeatedly, and combined with the cigarette smoke, it created this really unpleasant smell that was hard to be around. Carson was a non-smoker who had actually been quite vocal about the health dangers of tobacco use, making De Niro's appearance particularly challenging from a personal standpoint. However, Johnny's professionalism never wavered. He greeted De Niro warmly, though crew members noted he maintained a certain physical distance throughout their interaction. During the interview, Carson employed several techniques to manage the discomfort. He kept the conversation moving quickly, asking rapid-fire questions that didn't allow for long, contemplative pauses where the atmosphere might become too noticeable. He also frequently gestured broadly, creating air movement that helped dissipate the concentrated smell around the guest chair. What made De Niro's appearance unique was his complete lack of self-consciousness about his odor. He was a delightful conversationalist, funny and engaging, with wonderful stories from Hollywood's golden age. His personality was so charming that the audience remained entertained despite the challenging atmosphere in the studio. Johnny said afterward that Leonard was proof that talent could overcome almost anything, remembered a longtime producer. He genuinely enjoyed the conversation and De Niro's stories, even while dealing with the smell. He told us that sometimes you have to look past the packaging to appreciate the gift inside, which was a very Carson way of describing the situation. The crew, however, had a more difficult time with De Niro's visit. Camera operators and boom microphone operators, who had to remain in close proximity to the guest for extended periods, found the experience particularly challenging. One camera operator later admitted to breathing through his mouth for the entire segment to minimize the smell's impact. Following De Niro's departure, the upholstered guest chair required professional cleaning before it could be used again. The smell had transferred to the fabric so thoroughly that simply airing it out wasn't sufficient. A furniture cleaning specialist was brought in the next day to address the problem. Carson never publicly discussed De Niro's odor, maintaining his characteristic discretion about guest appearances. When De Niro passed away several years later, Carson paid tribute to him on air, praising his talent and contributions to cinema without any mention of the challenging aspects of his personal habits. It was typical Carson, focusing on what mattered while diplomatically ignoring what didn't. The incident reinforced Carson's reputation among Hollywood professionals as a host who treated everyone with respect regardless of circumstances. Word spread through the industry that Johnny would never embarrass a guest on air, no matter what challenges they presented. This reputation helped the show attract even the most eccentric personalities, knowing they would be treated fairly. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor burst onto the Hollywood scene in the mid-'80s as a fitness guru turned actress, promoting an extremely restrictive dietary lifestyle that she credited for her energy and appearance. Taylor authored several best-selling books about her eating philosophy, which emphasized raw foods, unusual juice combinations, and complete avoidance of most conventional meals. When she appeared on Carson's show to promote her latest book and film project, her dietary choices created an unexpected problem. Taylor was consuming massive amounts of garlic as part of her health regimen, believing it prevented illness and provided numerous wellness benefits. She apparently ate raw garlic cloves throughout the day, multiple times daily, creating a powerful odor that permeated everything about her. The garlic smell was unbelievable, recalled a makeup artist who worked with Taylor before her appearance. It wasn't like she'd just eaten garlic bread at dinner. This was concentrated raw garlic that had been building up in her system for who knows how long. When she breathed or spoke, it was like a physical force hitting you. Carson was informed about the situation by crew members who had encountered Taylor backstage. Unlike some odor situations where the problem was immediately obvious, the garlic scent wasn't apparent until Taylor began speaking, at which point it became overwhelming for anyone within conversational distance. During the interview, Carson's discomfort was visible to anyone watching carefully. He frequently leaned back in his chair, creating additional space between himself and Taylor. He turned his head away slightly when she delivered longer answers. Most tellingly, he conducted one of his shortest interviews of that season, wrapping up the segment several minutes earlier than scheduled. Johnny was absolutely struggling, remembered a camera operator who had a clear view of the host's face. You could see him trying not to react every time Jasmine spoke. He kept this pleasant expression, but his eyes were watering, and at one point, he actually held his breath for what seemed like 10 or 15 seconds. What made the situation more challenging was Taylor's enthusiasm about her dietary choices. She repeatedly referenced her health regimen during the interview, proudly discussing the raw garlic consumption that was causing everyone's discomfort. Carson made several gentle jokes about her dedication to wellness, but Taylor took them as compliments, completely missing the subtext. Carson actually tried to wrap up the interview twice before finally succeeding, noted a director who was watching from the control room. Taylor kept launching into new stories about her diet and lifestyle, extending the segment beyond what Johnny was comfortable with. You could see his desperation to end the conversation growing with each passing minute. Following the interview, Carson immediately left the stage and requested fresh air. A production assistant revealed that Johnny spent the commercial break outside the studio, taking deep breaths and drinking water to clear his senses. He returned for the next segment looking somewhat recovered, though several staff members noted he seemed unusually quiet for the rest of that evening's show. The garlic incident became one of the most discussed guest appearances among show staff, not because Taylor had been deliberately problematic, but because the situation illustrated how well-intentioned personal choices could create significant challenges for others. Taylor genuinely believed in her health philosophy and was simply living according to her principles, unaware that those principles had powerful aromatic consequences. Carson handled it with his usual grace, but privately told several of us that experience made him appreciate conventional diets, recalling a producer who spoke with Johnny after the show. He joked that garlic might keep vampires away, but it also keeps talk show hosts at a distance. He said it with humor, but you could tell the interview had been genuinely difficult for him. Taylor was never invited back to the show, though this was never officially explained or announced. When her name came up in booking discussions months later, Carson reportedly said something diplomatic about the show having moved in different directions, but staff members understood the real reason. The incident added another layer to Carson's growing legend as a host who could handle any situation with professionalism. Even when facing something as challenging as overwhelming garlic breath, he never embarrassed his guest or made the problem the focus of the segment. He simply endured, adapted, and moved on, maintaining the show's friendly atmosphere despite his personal discomfort. Marlon Brando had established himself as one of Hollywood's most serious dramatic actors, known for completely transforming himself physically and mentally for each role. By the time he appeared on Carson's show in the late 80s, Brando was promoting an intense film about addiction and life on the streets. His preparation for this role included some unusual choices that created perhaps the most memorable guest experience in the show's history. Brando had apparently been living in costume for his role, which involved portraying a homeless character struggling with severe substance problems. As part of his method preparation, he had been wearing the same clothing for weeks, sleeping outdoors occasionally, and deliberately avoiding bathing to achieve what he called authentic understanding of his character's experience. When Brando arrived at the studio, the reaction from staff was immediate and severe. Multiple crew members later described the smell as the worst they had ever encountered in a professional setting. It wasn't just body odor or unwashed clothing. It was a combination of smells that suggested Brando had taken his method preparation to dangerous extremes. We actually had people refuse to work the segment, revealed a stage manager who was present that day. Camera operators were drawing straws to see who would have to be positioned closest to the guest chair. One audio technician threatened to quit rather than attach a microphone to Brando. It was unprecedented. Carson eventually had to address the crew personally, asking them as a favor to him to please help get through the segment. Carson's handling of the situation revealed both his leadership and his limits. He agreed to conduct the interview, but requested that it be significantly shortened. He asked for additional ventilation in the studio. Most notably, he requested that a remote microphone setup be used, rather than requiring a crew member to physically approach Brando for a traditional lapel mic. During the interview itself, Carson's discomfort was more visible than in almost any other appearance. He sat as far back in his chair as physically possible. He frequently pressed his hand to his mouth and nose, ostensibly in thoughtful poses, but clearly attempting to filter the air. His responses were shorter than usual, and he moved through questions rapidly, clearly eager to conclude the segment. Johnny was barely holding it together, remembered a camera operator who filmed the interview. At one point, Vincent leaned forward to make a point, and you could see Carson actually recoil slightly. He recovered quickly and played it off, but the audience definitely noticed. There were visible reactions from people in the first few rows as well. Some were covering their noses, others looked genuinely concerned. What made Brando's appearance particularly problematic was his attitude about the situation. Unlike guests who were oblivious to their impact, Brando seemed almost proud of the discomfort he was causing. He made several comments during the interview about the importance of suffering for art and how real actors must be willing to sacrifice comfort, seemingly including everyone else's comfort in that calculation. Carson challenged him on this gently but directly, noted a producer who witnessed the exchange. Johnny said something like, "That's certainly dedicated, but does the dedication need to extend to the weeks leading up to filming?" It was as close as Carson came to directly criticizing a guest's choices during an interview. Brando seemed taken aback by the question, having apparently expected praise for his extreme method. Following the segment, the studio underwent the most extensive cleaning in its history. The guest chair was removed entirely and disposed of rather than cleaned, as the smell had permeated the upholstery beyond redemption. The stage floor was professionally treated. Air purifiers ran for hours. Several crew members reported feeling nauseated for the remainder of that day. Carson left immediately after the show, without his usual post-production meetings with staff. An assistant later revealed that Johnny had gone directly home to shower and change clothes, feeling that the smell had transferred to him during the interview. He reportedly threw away the suit he'd been wearing rather than attempting to have it cleaned. The Brando incident became a turning point for the show's guest policies. Producers implemented much stricter advanced screening procedures, including explicit discussions about personal hygiene expectations and character preparation limits. The policy stated that method acting preparation should not create health hazards or unreasonable working conditions for show staff. Carson later described the Brando appearance as one of the most challenging professional experiences of his career, not because of difficult questions or controversial topics, but simply because of the extreme physical discomfort involved. He told staff that he respected artistic dedication, but believed there were limits to how much that dedication should impact innocent bystanders. Brando never appeared on the show again, despite having a long career with many subsequent projects worth promoting. The unspoken ban was never officially acknowledged, but industry insiders understood that Brando had Brandoed a line that even Carson's legendary patience couldn't tolerate. Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn was a beloved comedic actress, known for her improvisational skills and outrageous sense of humor. She had appeared on Carson's show multiple times throughout the 80s, always delivering entertaining segments filled with laughter and unexpected moments. Her appearance in the summer of 1988, however, became memorable for entirely different reasons. Hepburn had recently adopted an extreme fitness regimen involving intense daily workouts, strict dietary protocols, and minimal use of conventional hygiene products. She had embraced a natural lifestyle philosophy that rejected most commercial deodorants and antiperspirants, believing them to contain harmful chemicals. Unfortunately, this philosophy coincided with her appearance on Carson's show during a particularly hot week when the studio's air conditioning was malfunctioning. The combination of factors created a perfect storm. Hepburn arrived at the studio having just completed an intense workout session that afternoon. The summer heat was oppressive. The studio's cooling system was operating at reduced capacity, and Hepburn's natural approach to hygiene meant she had no protection against the inevitable consequences of these conditions. By the time Hepburn reached the stage, the situation was apparent to everyone nearby. Her natural deodorant philosophy, combined with the day's exertion and heat, had resulted in a powerful body odor that became increasingly noticeable as she settled into the warm studio lights. Carson realized the problem immediately, but Marla was already on stage and the cameras were rolling, remembered a director who was managing the segment. Johnny made a split-second decision to proceed, but to keep the interview shorter than planned. You could see him making mental calculations about how to get through it. What made this situation particularly awkward was the personal history between Carson and Hepburn. They had developed a friendly rapport over her previous appearances, often engaging in playful banter and improvisational comedy. This familiarity made the current situation more uncomfortable, as Carson clearly didn't want to hurt someone he genuinely liked. During the interview, Carson employed every technique in his arsenal to manage the situation diplomatically. He made jokes about the studio heat, which the audience appreciated. He kept the conversation energetic and moving, preventing any lengthy pauses. He positioned himself at maximum distance while still maintaining the appearance of engaged conversation. Johnny was working overtime to make this okay, recalled a camera operator who was watching Carson closely. He was being so careful not to make Marla feel bad while also clearly struggling with the smell. At one point, she moved closer to him to tell a story, and you could see his entire body tense up, but he never let it show on his face. Hepburn, to her credit, seemed to realize something was amiss midway through the interview, while never explicitly acknowledging the situation, she began making self-deprecating jokes about her workout routine in the heat, possibly having sensed Carson's subtle discomfort. Her awareness seemed to dawn gradually, and her increasingly nervous energy suggested growing mortification. Following the commercial break that ended her segment, Hepburn apparently approached Carson privately and apologized profusely. Multiple staff members reported that she was genuinely distressed about the situation, having not realized how the various factors would combine to create such an unfortunate circumstance. Carson was gracious about it, as always, remembered a producer who witnessed their backstage conversation. He told Marla that these things happen, that everyone understood it was unintentional, and that she shouldn't worry about it. He gave her a hug, which was very Johnny, making her feel better even though he was the one who had suffered through the interview. The incident didn't damage Hepburn's relationship with the show. She appeared several more times over the following years, and she and Carson laughed about the incident privately on multiple occasions. Hepburn later joked in other interviews about her disastrous natural deodorant experiment, referring to it as the summer she learned that some chemicals exist for very good reasons. What distinguished this situation from other odor-related guest appearances was the mutual respect and understanding between Carson and Hepburn. Unlike guests who were oblivious or defensive, Hepburn recognized the problem, felt genuine remorse, and maintained enough perspective to eventually find humor in the situation. Carson's handling of the Hepburn incident became another example of his fundamental decency. He protected her dignity during the broadcast, accepted her apology graciously afterward, and never mentioned the incident publicly. Their friendship survived an awkward moment because both parties approached it with maturity and kindness. Robin Williams. Robin Williams was a British theatrical actor who had transitioned to film in the mid-80s, bringing his classical training and distinctive style to Hollywood productions. Williams was known for his eccentric personal habits, his contempt for American commercial culture, and his outspoken views about artistic integrity. When he appeared on Carson's show to promote his latest film, his peculiar dietary and hygiene choices created what staff later described as a uniquely unpleasant experience. Williams was a devoted practitioner of an obscure dietary philosophy that involved consuming large amounts of fermented foods, unusual herbal supplements, and what he described as purifying teas. These dietary choices had a profound impact on his body chemistry, creating an odor that multiple crew members struggled to describe politely. It wasn't any single identifiable smell, explained a production assistant who encountered Williams backstage. It was this strange, sour, fermented smell that seemed to come from his pores. Some people compared it to old cheese. Others said it was more like compost. Everyone agreed it was deeply unpleasant and unlike anything they'd experienced before. Carson was warned about Williams's unusual aroma before the segment, but the advanced description hadn't fully prepared him for the reality. When Williams entered the stage, Johnny's professional smile momentarily faltered before he recovered his composure. Audience members in the front rows visibly reacted, with several people's expressions of surprise captured clearly on camera. What made Williams' appearance particularly challenging was his combative attitude during the interview. Unlike most guests who were eager to please and promote their projects, Williams seemed to take perverse pleasure in being difficult. He gave curt, dismissive answers to Carson's questions. He criticized American entertainment values. He treated the entire interview as beneath his dignity. Johnny was dealing with the smell and the attitude simultaneously, which was really testing his limits. Remembered a director who was in the control booth. Williams was being deliberately unpleasant, almost as if he wanted to make the interview difficult. Combined with the odor situation, it was one of the rare times you saw Carson genuinely lose patience with a guest. During a particularly dismissive response from Williams, Carson made an uncharacteristic comment. He said something like, "Well, your dedication to your craft certainly extends to all your senses." The audience, who had been growing restless with Williams' rudeness, erupted in laughter. Williams appeared confused, not grasping the double meaning, while Carson maintained an innocent expression. That was as close as Carson ever came to directly referencing a guest's odor on air, noted a writer who worked on the show. It was subtle enough that Williams didn't catch it, but everyone else understood exactly what Johnny meant. It was a moment of solidarity with the audience, acknowledging that they were all experiencing something unpleasant together. The interview was cut significantly shorter than originally planned, ending abruptly after Williams made a particularly pretentious statement about American audiences lacking sophistication. Carson thanked him with obvious finality, and Williams left the stage seeming satisfied that he had maintained his artistic integrity by being difficult. Following Williams' departure, Carson made a rare on-air comment about a guest. He told the audience, "Well, that was certainly an experience for all the senses." The audience, who had sat through Williams' rudeness and apparent odor, cheered appreciatively. It was a subtle acknowledgement of shared discomfort and a collective sigh of relief. Carson later told staff that Williams represented everything he disliked about certain pretentious artists, recalled a longtime producer. Not just the hygiene issues, but the contempt for audiences, the rudeness disguised as integrity, the belief that being difficult was somehow equivalent to being serious. Johnny said something like, "Talent doesn't give you permission to be unkind to people or to subject them to unpleasant experiences unnecessarily." Williams was never invited back to the show, and Carson reportedly told bookers that the actor's name should be added to a very short list of guests who were unwelcome regardless of their career developments. It was a rare permanent ban, reserved for guests who had brandoed multiple lines simultaneously. The Williams incident illustrated an important principle in Carson's approach to hosting. While he showed enormous patience for unintentional problems and worked to protect guests from embarrassment, he had limited tolerance for those who combined difficult behavior with disregard for others' comfort. In such cases, his diplomatic approach gave way to pointed comments and permanent consequences. The incident also reinforced Carson's reputation among Hollywood professionals as someone who valued kindness and consideration above fame or prestige. Word spread through the industry that treating Carson's crew poorly or showing contempt for his audience would result in exclusion from his show, regardless of box office success or critical acclaim. Johnny Carson's 25 years hosting his show provided countless examples of grace under pressure, diplomatic problem-solving, and commitment to treating everyone with respect regardless of circumstances. The odor-related guest appearances, while uncomfortable at the time, became legendary examples of his ability to navigate impossible situations while maintaining his principles.